Hello and welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. And thank you so sincerely for being a cherished part of our community. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving us without the necessary budget to maintain operations and pay our hardworking team. If you find yourself enjoying today's tale, we politely ask that you consider supporting us with just $1 to help our staff afford their daily lives and continue creating these adventures for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. We always assumed that when the apex predators of the galaxy finally came for us, it would be to conquer. We were so incredibly fragile compared to the star-devouring leviathans that roamed the cosmic dark. But, on a random cycle, the most terrifying force in the known universe did not demand our surrender. They demanded something far more terrifying. They handed over their children. The Aegis Mobile Asylum Station shuddered violently, its battered titanium hull groaning in deep, agonizing protests as it clawed its way through the screaming nebula. Outside the heavily reinforced viewport, violent magnetic storms whipped in chaotic, unpredictable arcs of violet and blinding white energy. These tempests were not just weather events. They possessed enough sheer kinetic fury to tear an entire dreadnought fleet into microscopic shrapnel. Inside the vessel, the atmosphere was a chaotic, nerve-shredding symphony of blaring proximity klaxons and flickering, dying emergency lights. Edwin Bucher wiped a thick streak of freezing sweat from his brow, his hands trembling slightly as he hammered commands into the main terminal. As the station's chief spatial ecologist and resident xenopsychologist, his sole, desperate focus was keeping the fragile artificial biosphere from a total cascade failure. The structural integrity grid was operating at barely 40% capacity, and the power relays were sparking dangerously. If the life support matrix failed now, the 3,000 civilian refugees currently slumbering in deep cryo-sleep would simply suffocate in the cold, unforgiving dark, completely unaware of their own demise. Then, the long-range proximity radar screamed one final, agonizing warning before going entirely black. It was not a system malfunction. It was a physical eclipse. A shadow, exponentially larger than a planetary moon, swallowed the Aegis whole. Edwin rushed to the main observation deck, his breath catching painfully in his throat as his eyes widened in sheer terror. Emerging from the violent, swirling cosmic gases of the nebula was a massive fleet of Drakari. They were undeniably the apex predators of the known universe. Terrifying, awe-inspiring hybrids of gargantuan reptilian biology and dark matter mechanics. Their impenetrable scales were forged from the crushed carbon of dead planets, and they sustained their colossal bodies by draining the energy of collapsing star cores. Just one of their vanguard scout ships possessed enough firepower to crack the Earth cleanly in half. And right now, a full, battle-ready armada had completely surrounded his tiny, unarmed civilian vessel. Edwin braced his body, waiting for the inevitable, blinding blast of hyperplasma that would vaporize them all into stardust. Instead, the monolithic dreadnought closest to the Aegis slowly locked onto their primary airlock, a massive docking umbilical, dripping with highly toxic cryogenic coolant, slammed brutally into the station's external hull. The heavy pressure seals hissed loudly as they forced a connection. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the quarantine bay, Edwin watched in stunned silence as the leader of the Drakari strike force materialized. The creature was a towering, walking nightmare of jagged biometallic armor and pulsating molten veins. But the beast did not raise a weapon. Instead, it raised massive, razor-sharp claws to its own immense chest and violently tore apart its heavy front plating. Searing, blinding heat immediately flooded the airlock chamber, reaching deep into its own glowing, hollowed-out thoracic cavity. The alien warlord carefully extracted 3 glowing, pulsating incubation pods. The pods were radiating a heat so intense that the bay's atmospheric scrubbers immediately caught fire. The Drakari leader gently placed the 3 spherical krakens onto the scorched metal floor of the airlock. The massive alien paused, locking its burning, 4-pupiled eyes directly with Edwin's terrified gaze. The creature did not speak a single word aloud. Instead, a deafening telepathic shockwave slammed directly into Edwin's cerebral cortex, carrying the immense emotional weight of a dying sun. "Protect them!" The heavy umbilical detached violently. The massive Drakari armada immediately spun around, their colossal engines igniting the nebula gas into a fiery inferno, and vanished back into the storm, clearly fleeing from an unseen, encroaching terror that defied comprehension. Edwin stood frozen, staring blankly at the airlock. The thick outer doors sealed shut, the heavy inner doors hissed open. The temperature in the bay spiked to critical levels immediately. The 3 Drakari larvae burst aggressively from their pods. They were roughly the size of large earth wolves, but their bodies were composed of pure, unstable thermal energy and jagged, shifting metallic scales. They screeched wildly, their voices sounding like grinding industrial gears, and immediately began to scramble frantically across the deck. Drakari hatchlings were born with a volatile core temperature capable of melting military-grade steel into liquid slag. In their natural habitat, they required the massive, continuous energy absorption of an entire armada to safely dissipate their excess heat. But their fleet was currently running for its life. Without a colossal heat sink, the hyperactive larvae would unintentionally burn the Aegis down to its subatomic particles in less than 2 hours. They were already gouging glowing, molten trenches into the heavily reinforced flooring, just by excitedly pacing back and forth. Panic was a luxury Edwin simply could not afford. Relying entirely on his specialized ecological training, he dashed to the main control console and forcefully bypassed all standard safety protocols. He immediately routed the frightened hatchlings through a heavy containment corridor directly into Sector 4. Sector 4 was the winter frost biome, a heavy-duty, massive ecological zone specifically designed to simulate harsh, sub-zero Arctic environments. Edwin sealed himself inside a heavy-duty, localized thermal suit and stepped cautiously into the freezing enclosure. The artificial snow immediately turned to thick, blinding steam as the 3 alien infants bounded joyfully into the room. They shrieked and rolled aggressively into the hyperflora lakes, the supercooled water boiling furiously upon contact, successfully drawing the dangerous ambient heat away from their unstable bodies and stabilizing their cores. Slowly, and very cautiously, Edwin approached the largest of the 3 infants. He activated his heavy-duty magnetic handling gloves, protective items usually reserved for wrangling highly radioactive reactor debris. The creature snapped at him defensively, its jaws glowing white-hot. A single bite would sever his arm cleanly at the shoulder, cauterizing the wound instantly. But Edwin did not pull away. He knelt down in the rapidly melting snow, projecting calm, steady intent, and gently rested his thick, magnetic palms against the beast's scalding, heavily armored neck. He began to stroke the metallic ridges, applying just enough firm pressure to perfectly mimic the soothing, grooming habits of terrestrial reptiles. Miraculously, the hatchling stopped thrashing. It let out a low, rumbling purr that rattled Edwin's teeth, leaning its heavy head into the fragile human's gentle touch. As he comforted the deadliest predators in the galaxy, a profound, unsettling mystery gnawed at Edwin's mind. The Aegis was a pathetic, rusted bucket of a civilian refuge. It had 0 heavy weapons, 0 shielding, and 0 tactical value in a galactic war. The Drakari possessed impregnable fortresses, hidden deep within the safest sectors of the galactic core. So, why did they leave their most precious, vulnerable cargo here? More importantly, Why did the absolute most terrifying creatures in the cosmos look at a frail, completely unarmed human ecologist and decide he was the only one they could trust with their children? The rhythmic hum of the cryogenic coolers in Sector 4 finally overpowered the chaotic shrieking of the alien infants. It took nearly 3 hours of continuous, delicate handling to coax the 3 Drakari hatchlings into a deep, thermally stable slumber among the boiling frost plains. Edwin slumped against the reinforced observation glass, his muscles screaming from the adrenaline crash. He prayed for just one moment of quiet. The universe, however, had a vastly different itinerary. The emergency lighting in the corridor did not flicker or spark. It simply began to drown. The shadows stretching across the titanium bulkheads stopped obeying the basic laws of physics. They detached from the objects casting them and began to pool together on the floor, slithering like intelligent oil toward the primary medical bay. A sudden, bone-deep chill replaced the oppressive ambient heat left over from the Drakari. This was not a physical cold. It was the absolute absence of molecular vibration. Edwin forced his exhausted legs to move, tracking the creeping darkness. He knew exactly what this meant. Every xenopsychology textbook in his academy warned of the Vesperins. They were the ultimate psychological parasites, entities forged entirely from localized dark matter and raw telepathic force. They possessed no fixed physical geometry. Merely looking at an adult Vesperin in its true form was enough to shatter the cognitive processing centers of a lesser species, inducing instantaneous and irreversible madness through violent mental resonance. As Edwin breached the medical bay, the air pressure dropped to a near vacuum. Suspended precisely in the center of the room was a perfectly spherical vortex of consuming blackness. It pulsed once, emitting a frequency that made Edwin's teeth ache, before collapsing inward. In its place, hovering inches above the sterile decking, were 5 condensed orbs of shifting, shadowy matter, Vesperin young, just like the cosmic dragons before them. The unseen parents had breached the veil of slip space, deposited their most vulnerable offspring onto the Aegis, and vanished instantly without leaving a single trace or instruction. Before Edwin could even begin to process this impossible reality, a deafening roar shook the deck plates beneath his boots. The Drakari hatchlings had awakened. They could sense it. Pure physical energy, loud and volatile, inherently despised pure psychic energy, silent and absolute. They were cosmic apex predators, but they were also natural enemies of the highest order. The 3 biometallic dragons burst through the heavy containment doors of the medical bay, their scales glowing cherry red with sudden aggression. They hissed violently, thrashing their heavy tails and smashing a diagnostic console into thousands of useless pieces. In immediate response, the 5 Vesperin young expanded defensively. They released a sweeping, concentrated wave of telepathic defense. They did not attack the body. They attacked the mind. The psychic shockwave hit Edwin like a physical blow to the chest. He dropped to his knees, clutching his skull as blinding agony tore through his neural pathways. The room dissolved around him. The Vesperin resonance projected overwhelming hallucinations of absolute despair, the crushing weight of isolation, and the terrifying void of deep space. It was the defensive mechanism of frightened children, unfiltered and utterly devastating to any sentient mind. Edwin fumbled blindly for his emergency medical pouch, his shaking fingers searching for a heavy neural sedative to shut off his brain before it completely fractured. But his fingers brushed against his own bare chest, feeling the frantic, desperate hammering of his heart. He gasped for air, and in that fleeting second of clarity, he realized something incredible. The pain was not trying to break him. It was just raw, unguided emotion. The apex species of the galaxy were extreme specialists. They were designed for pure domination, either physical or mental. They had absolutely no biological mechanism for processing vulnerability, but humans did. Humanity had evolved on a chaotic, terrifying death world, surviving not by having the sharpest claws or the strongest minds, but through the bizarre evolutionary trait of extreme empathy. The human brain possessed a highly unique, emotional digestive system. It could take in profound grief, terror, and sorrow, process it, and redirect it into compassion. Humans were nature's ultimate psychological grounding rods. Edwin slowly pushed the medical pouch away. He let go of his fear. He forced himself to absorb the crushing psychic waves radiating from the terrified shadows, letting their manufactured despair wash over his consciousness. He did not fight the darkness. He accepted it. Unarmed, completely defenseless, and surrounded by the most dangerous infants in existence, Edwin sat cross-legged in the dead center of the ruined medical bay. He took a deep, steadying breath and began to sing. "Hush now, my little ones. The stars are all sleeping." It was an ancient earth lullaby, a fragile melody carried through thousands of generations. As he sang, he reached up and tapped the small neural link projector on his temple. Instead of displaying diagnostic readouts, he broadcasted a direct feed of his own innermost memories onto the ceiling. The sterile room was bathed in the warm, golden hues of a late summer sunset on Earth. He projected the feeling of a soft breeze, the smell of fresh rain on dry dirt, and the overwhelming, unconditional warmth of his mother holding him when he was just a child. The effect was instantaneous. The sheer, overwhelming compassion and emotional stability of the human mind acted as a massive counter-frequency. The soothing telepathic wave of Edwin's love neutralized the depressive hallucinations completely. The 5 shadowy orbs stopped trembling, their dark matter softening into smooth, gentle ripples. Across the room, the Drakari hatchlings ceased their aggressive posturing. The sudden influx of peaceful psychic energy doused their frantic internal fires. One by one, the shadows drifted downward, resting gently against Edwin's left side. Slowly, cautiously, the metallic dragons crept forward, curling their heavy, warm bodies against his right side. For the first time in the recorded history of the cosmos, the fires of creation and the shadows of the void rested peacefully against the fragile shield of a human heart. Surviving the initial encounter was a miracle, but keeping these galactic miracles alive proved to be a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. Edwin rapidly transformed Sector 4 into a chaotic, makeshift nursery partitioned into 2 dangerously extreme biomes. On one side was a modified thermal reactor chamber, heavily reinforced to withstand the constant, searing heat generated by the hyperactive Drakari. On the opposite end, completely sealed off by thick lead and dampening fields, was the absolute zero, light suppression zone designed to stabilize the shifting, dark matter forms of the Vesperins. Balancing the atmospheric regulators between a literal furnace and a localized black hole required Edwin's constant, undivided attention. He was practically living on nutrient paste and sheer willpower, managing to snatch barely 2 hours of fractured sleep each day. The exhaustion weighed heavily on him. But the real challenge was managing the accidental collisions of 2 fundamentally incompatible species. Neither group of infants possessed an ounce of malice, yet their basic biological functions were catastrophic. The tipping point occurred during a mandatory joint observation period. The largest Drakari hatchling, playfully chasing its own spiked tail, suddenly paused, took a deep breath, and let out a massive, involuntary sneeze. A bright, searing glob of superheated plasma shot across the room, instantly incinerating a delicate, meticulously arranged pile of crystallized carbon the Vesperin children had been using as a form of sensory expression. The retaliation was instantaneous and completely terrifying. The aggrieved Vesperin, lacking physical vocal cords to yell, immediately expanded its shadowy mass and projected a concentrated, localized nightmare directly into the Drakari's mind. The heavily armored dragon let out a high-pitched, thoroughly undignified yelp, tumbling backward into the safety of a titanium bulkhead and covering its eyes with its massive paws, whimpering loudly as phantom terrors danced in its head. Edwin rushed into the fray, his boots clanking heavily against the scorched deck. He did not yell, and he explicitly refused to punish either of them. Instead, he dropped to his knees, right in the middle of the standoff. We do not burn things that belong to others, and we absolutely do not put scary pictures in our friends' heads. Edwin scolded gently, projecting a stern but deeply loving calmness that immediately grounded the agitated room. He realized then that they needed a bridge, a way to interact without triggering their volatile defenses. Edwin spent the next 72 hours locked in the engineering bay, cannibalizing spare parts to forge a series of indestructible, energy-neutralizing toys. He crafted heavy spheres out of depleted uranium, coated in thermal dampening foam. He taught them to roll the spheres back and forth, using his own human hands as the central relay station. Slowly, painfully, he taught the fires of creation and the shadows of the void how to play. The true breakthrough, however, arrived quite by accident during a routine maintenance cycle. A small Vesperin, curiously exploring the station's labyrinthine ventilation shafts, managed to wedge itself deeply inside a primary cryocooler. The intense, localized freezing locked the dark matter entity into a rigid, physical state, leaving it completely trapped and vibrating with raw panic. Edwin arrived with his heavy pry bars, but the angle was impossible. If he forced the metal, the sheer kinetic shock would shatter the crystallized Vesperin into dust. Before Edwin could formulate a backup plan, the smallest Drakari hatchling nudged him aside. The little dragon assessed the frozen mechanism, its internal furnace rumbling thoughtfully. Looking up at Edwin for permission, the creature carefully extended one razor-sharp claw, heating the tip until it glowed a dull, controlled orange. Under Edwin's calm, encouraging whispers, the Drakari performed an act of unimaginable surgical precision. It pressed its heated talon against the frozen hinges, expertly melting the ice away layer by layer, without ever raising the ambient temperature high enough to harm the terrified shadow trapped inside. The door popped open, and the Vesperin tumbled out, exhausted but entirely unharmed. For a long, tense moment, the two natural enemies just stared at each other. Then, the shadowy Vesperin reached out and gently brushed against the Drakari's heavy, armored snout. It was the very first time in the recorded history of their ancient, warring species that physical contact had been made without a single drop of blood being spilled. From that cycle onward, their development accelerated at a terrifying rate. By the fourth month, the Drakari hatchlings were no longer clumsy, volatile balls of fire. They had grown to the size of adult terrestrial lions, their soft scales hardening into interlocking plates of impenetrable biometallic armor. Simultaneously, the Vesperins began to condense their chaotic dark matter, slowly shaping themselves to mimic the bipedal form of their human caretaker, eventually solidifying into tall, graceful humanoid figures with eyes that glowed like captured starlight. The defining miracle of Edwin's crazy endeavor finally presented itself precisely at the 6-month mark. He had dragged himself to the nursery, expecting to begin the grueling, 2-hour process of wrangling them into their separate, extreme environments for the rest cycle. Instead, he found the quarantine chambers completely empty. Panic flared briefly before he noticed a massive, huddled mound in the center of the neutral play area. The 3 massive Drakari were curled tightly together, radiating their usual intense, furnace-like heat. Woven seamlessly between them, wrapping their cool, dark matter limbs around the glowing scales, were the 5 Vesperins. The naturally freezing entities were absorbing the excess heat of the dragons, while the dragons provided a perfect, stable thermal anchor for the shadows. Together, they had created a flawless, self-sustaining biological climate control system. entirely negating the need for the station's failing environmental regulators. Edwin stood in the doorway, a profound sense of awe washing over his exhausted mind. Right in the center of the impossible pile, cushioning the heads of the apex predators and the psychic ghosts alike, was his old, frayed, heavy-duty engineering jacket. The illusion of safety shattered with a sound that defied the very concept of acoustics. It was not an explosion. It was a profound, cosmic tearing, as if the fabric of reality itself was being violently ripped apart. The screaming nebula, that chaotic maelstrom of violent magnetic storms and violet energy, was never a natural phenomenon at all. It was merely the displacement wave. It was the bow shock of something entirely incomprehensible. The true threat had finally arrived. Galactic scholars spoke of it only in hushed, terrified whispers, referring to the anomaly as the null tide. It was a gargantuan, inorganic leviathan, a sprawling entity composed of antimatter and dead cosmic strings. It did not conquer planets for resources. It simply swept across whole sectors, systematically swallowing the life energy of entire civilizations to sustain its own cold, mechanical existence. This was the unspeakable horror that had forced the two most dominant, fearsome armadas in the universe to abandon their young and run for their lives. And now, its gaze had fallen upon the fragile, helpless Aegis. The station's primary defensive shields did not even register the attack before dropping to 0% efficiency. A single, colossal tendril of the null tide, resembling a jagged shard of absolute nothingness, pierced straight through the titanium hull of the upper observation deck. The devastation was immediate and absolute. The ambient temperature plummeted so drastically that the very air inside the corridors crystallized, falling to the deck as heavy, suffocating snow. Every single communication relay flatlined instantly. The Aegis was completely blind, deaf, and bleeding out into the unforgiving vacuum. Down in the makeshift nursery, the primal instincts of the cosmic apex predators violently reasserted themselves. The sudden, overwhelming presence of the null tide triggered an ancient, ingrained panic response. The three Drakari, now the size of heavy assault vehicles, roared with a deafening fury. Their biometallic scales flared with blinding, unstable plasma as they prepared to charge the breached hull. It was a suicide run. Their immature cores would detonate harmlessly against the Leviathan, extinguishing their lives in a fraction of a second. Simultaneously, the five Vesperans began to vibrate at a dangerous, lethal frequency. Their humanoid forms dissolved back into chaotic dark matter as they desperately attempted to tear open a localized slipspace portal. Without an adult to anchor the spatial geometry, the sheer gravitational shear of an unguided jump would literally shred their fragile forms into subatomic dust. Both species were choosing how they wanted to die. Edwin Bucher refused to accept either outcome. Throwing his frail, unarmored human body forward, Edwin slammed himself violently against the heavy blast doors, effectively sealing the only exit. The searing heat from the agitated dragons blistered the skin on his arms, while the localized gravitational distortions of the frantic shadows threatened to crush his ribcage. "You are not going out there," Edwin screamed, his voice cracking from the intense pressure drop, his arms spread wide to block their path. "I will not let you die." A second tendril from the null tide struck the station, sending a massive, devastating pulse of necrotic energy rippling through the bulkheads. The structural integrity of the sector was failing rapidly. The nursery's localized shielding was drawing its power from the main grid, but the main grid was actively being drained by the Leviathan outside. In less than 60 seconds, the protective barrier would collapse, and the children would be consumed. There was only one mathematical solution, and it required a terrible, absolute price. Edwin desperately ripped the emergency maintenance panel off the wall beside the blast door. His fingers flew across the manual override switches, bleeding As he forced the heavy physical relays into position, he engaged the catastrophic redirection protocol. He intentionally severed all life support, all atmospheric regulators, and all thermal shielding to his own side of the bulkhead. He then stripped the power core of his heavy-duty thermal suit, routing 100% of the station's remaining energy directly into the nursery's isolated containment grid. The blast doors sealed permanently with a heavy, final clank. Inside, the children were encased in an impenetrable fortress of pure energy. Outside, Edwin was left with absolutely nothing. The psychic and physical wave of the null tide washed directly over him. Unfiltered vacuum radiation tore through his unshielded body. The overwhelming, crushing despair of the Leviathan slammed into his mind, stripping away every ounce of warmth he had left. Edwin slumped heavily against the reinforced glass of the blast door. His lungs seized as the oxygen instantly froze in his throat. His heart, struggling against the profound cold, rapidly dropped to 40 beats per minute, then 30, then 20. He slid down the glass, leaving a smear of crimson frost, until he collapsed onto the icy deck. His vision darkened to a tiny pinpoint. His final, fading thought entirely focused on the hope that the shielding would hold long enough for the storm to pass. Inside the illuminated safety of the nursery, the chaos abruptly ceased. The Drakari extinguished their violent flames. The Vesperans solidified back into their graceful forms. They rushed to the thick observation glass, pressing their claws and shadowy hands against the barrier. They looked down at the tiny, fragile human who had spent the last several months feeding them, singing to them, and teaching them how to exist without destroying each other. They watched his chest stop moving. They watched the life fade from the only creature in the galaxy that had ever shown them unconditional warmth. In that agonizing, silent moment, the absolute terror of the nulltide evaporated from their minds. The frantic, animalistic drive for self-preservation was completely overridden. The despair of watching their father fall ignited something entirely new within their alien biology. It was not a weapon. It was not a defense mechanism. It was an overwhelming, earth-shattering surge of love, bound tightly to the profound understanding of voluntary sacrifice. And it was about to change the fundamental laws of the universe. The heavy blast doors, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of deep space and the violent impacts of kinetic weaponry, did not explode outward. Instead, they simply ceased to exist as a physical barrier. The 3 Drakari and the 5 Vesperans did not flee the encroaching terror of the nulltide. Nor did they turn on each other in the blind panic of their primal instincts. Moving with a synchronized, terrifying grace, they stepped through the threshold of the breached nursery and immediately surrounded Edwin's motionless, rapidly freezing body. For the first time in the recorded history of the cosmos, an impossible biological reaction occurred. The natural laws governing matter and energy were completely rewritten on the scarred deck plates of the Aegis. The Vesperans, beings of pure, absolute cold and telepathic dark matter, wrapped their shadowy limbs entirely around the burning, biomechanical plasma bodies of the Drakari hatchlings. They did not annihilate one another. Instead, they seamlessly merged, creating a localized dome of harmonized energy directly over their fallen caretaker. As the symbiotic dome formed, a profound surge of psychic resonance bridged the gap between the alien infants and Edwin's fading consciousness. He was no longer just a dying man on a freezing floor. His mind was forcefully, yet gently, pulled into a vast, ancient stream of genetic memory. The truth of the universe unfolded before his mind's eye like a blooming lotus of pure starlight. The colossal armadas of the Drakari and the silent, terrifying conclaves of the Vesperans had never been fleeing from the nulltide. They had not abandoned their most precious offspring in the middle of a war zone. Edwin saw the tragic, undeniable reality of their existence. Both apex species were dying, for millions of years, They had dominated the galaxies, but their biological structures had become far too extreme. The Drakari were trapped in an endless cycle of consuming hotter and hotter stars, their physical forms incapable of evolving past their own destructive nature. The Vesperans were similarly doomed, their ethereal forms becoming increasingly detached from physical reality, slowly fading into the absolute void. They had reached a genetic dead end. They were stagnant, and stagnation in the universe meant absolute extinction. They needed a catalyst. They needed a biological mechanism capable of taking two fundamentally incompatible, extreme ends of the cosmic spectrum and welding them together into a new, sustainable future. They did not choose the human race because Earth was a heavily fortified sanctuary. They chose humanity because of the unique, bizarre frequency of the human mind. In a universe governed by absolute logic, raw power, and the cold equations of survival, the human brain was the only organ capable of unconditional empathy. That specific emotional wavelength, the ability to love a terrifying monster, the capacity to process intense fear and transform it into gentle compassion, was the rarest element in existence. It was the universal solvent for extreme DNA. You were never just a guardian. A booming, dual-toned voice echoed within the deepest chambers of Edwin's soul, carrying the lingering consciousness of the alien parents. You are the evolutionary crucible. You are the fire and the anvil that will forge our salvation. In the physical world, the reaction reached its absolute zenith. By using Edwin's faint, slowing heartbeat and his desperate, lingering will to live as a biological anchor, the children achieved perfect resonance. The transformation was breathtaking. The heavy, metallic bodies of the Drakari erupted, but not with plasma. Massive, sweeping wings of solid dark matter tore from their shoulders, giving the heavy dragons unprecedented agility and control over localized gravity. Simultaneously, the shifting, chaotic shadows of the Vesperans solidified. They gained sleek, glowing biomechanical armor plating, their forms anchoring securely to the physical plane while retaining their devastating telepathic might. They were no longer two separate, warring species. They had become a singular, symbiotic entity of unparalleled perfection, a protector-class hybrid that the universe had never seen before. Outside the station, the gargantuan, necrotic tendril of the Nulltide prepared to deliver the final, crushing blow. But the children were ready. Possessing both the sheer physical destructive force of the dragons and the reality-manipulating psychic power of the shadows, the 8 infants stood as one. They opened their maws and raised their newly armored hands, unleashing a combined counterattack. But this was not a beam of radiation or fire. It was a massive, concentrated shockwave of pure, weaponized emotion. It was formed entirely from the warm, vibrant memories Edwin had freely given them over the past 6 months. It was the golden hue of an earth sunset, the gentle melody of an ancient lullaby, and the profound, unyielding warmth of a father's protective embrace. This brilliant, blinding wave of pure life energy slammed into the absolute nothingness of the Nulltide. The Leviathan shrieked, a soundless vibration that cracked nearby asteroids into dust. The concept of love and creation was absolute poison to a creature of the void. The massive tendril violently recoiled, burning away into gray ash. The entire entity was forcibly blasted backward, expelled entirely from the boundaries of the screaming nebula. With the threat vanquished, the radiant dome of the newly evolved children gently collapsed inward. The sheer volume of life energy they had generated did not simply dissipate into the vacuum. It cascaded directly back into the frozen, battered body of the man who had catalyzed their rebirth. Edwin gasped loudly, his eyes snapping open as a rush of incredible warmth flooded his veins. The agonizing frostbite reversed instantly. His damaged lungs expanded deeply, breathing in air that was suddenly warm and perfectly purified. The lethal radiation sickness was scrubbed cleanly from his cellular structure. He sat up, completely healed, completely whole, and found himself surrounded by 8 magnificent, glowing beings who lowered their heads reverently to the floor, waiting for their father to stand. The oppressive void left by the retreating nulltide was quickly filled. The fabric of slipspace tore open, not with the violent cosmic fury of a battle, but with the synchronized, majestic grace of an incoming tide. The colossal armadas of the Dracari and the silent, imposing conclaves of the Vesperans emerged simultaneously into the clear sector. This time, their weapon batteries were entirely powered down. Their offensive shielding was completely inactive. They had come not as conquerors, nor as desperate fugitives, but as silent witnesses to a miracle. Through the shattered observation deck of the Aegis, the apex predators of the galaxy looked down upon the ruined nursery. What they saw brought the most terrifying beings in existence to an absolute, stunned standstill. Their offspring were no longer volatile, destructive larvae or fragmented, terrified shadows. They stood tall and proud, magnificent hybrids of hardened biomechanics and stabilized dark matter. The ancient, desperate gamble conceived by the leaders of both species had succeeded beyond their wildest comprehension. The children were perfectly balanced, wielding a power that did not consume, but fiercely protected. It was finally time for them to return to the stars. But they were no longer the wild animals that had been unceremoniously dumped on a fragile civilian station. The largest of the newly evolved Dracari, its massive wings of solid dark matter folded neatly against its armored back, slowly approached Edwin. The dragon gently lowered its massive head, carefully rubbing a jagged horn against the human's fragile shoulder. The heat was perfectly controlled now, radiating nothing but a comforting, gentle warmth, just like the hearth of an Earth home. Beside the dragon, a Vesperan, perfectly maintaining the glowing, bipedal form of a human, stepped forward. The being raised 2 biometallic fingers and softly placed them against Edwin's forehead. It was a telepathic kiss, a profound emotional transfer that carefully copied every single memory of his patience, his singing, and his unwavering love, locking it permanently into the eternal genetic archive of their entire species. The massive boarding umbilicals reattached to the Aegis. The heavy blast doors hissed open, and the supreme leaders of the 2 most feared races in the universe stepped directly onto the human vessel. The Dracari warlord, towering tens of meters into the air, and the Vesperan high priest, a looming monolith of shifting shadow, slowly approached the exhausted ecologist. Then, in a synchronized movement that sent profound shockwaves through the very foundation of galactic history, both entities lowered their massive bodies. The warlord and the priest dropped to one knee, bowing their heavy heads before the tiny, unassuming man from Earth. The station's universal translation matrix crackled to life, broadcasting a booming, dual-toned voice that resonated through every single corridor of the Aegis. We once believed that this vast universe belonged only to the strongest. The leaders spoke in perfect, reverent unison. We believed that domination and fear were the only true paths to survival. Today, you have taught us that this universe can only be truly saved by someone with a heart large enough to hold it. The cosmic leviathans rose slowly, gathering their miraculous children, and returned to their mighty flagships. The heavy docking clamps released, and the armadas silently slipped back into the folds of deep space, carrying the living bridges of peace and the absolute future of their evolution. The Aegis was left alone once more, bathed in the quiet, peaceful starlight of the cleared nebula. Edwin Bucher walked slowly to the staff break room. He brewed a simple, hot cup of black coffee and stood by the reinforced glass, looking out into the endless, silent expanse. A profound sense of peace washed over his tired soul. He knew, with absolute certainty, that from this day forward, in every dark and dangerous corner of the galaxy, the human race would always be fiercely protected by the apex predators of the cosmos. Humanity did not need world-ending lasers or impenetrable shields. They possessed the ultimate, undeniable power of the universe, the absolute refusal to ever let go. Thank you so incredibly much for joining us on this journey today. We would truly love to know where you are listening to this story from, so please let us know in the comments below. If you found yourself moved by today's tale, we humbly ask for your support. As we mentioned earlier, our channel is completely demonetized by YouTube, and we rely entirely on your kindness to survive. By donating just $1 through the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the link in the description and pinned comment, you directly help our dedicated staff feed their families and allow us to keep bringing these wonderful sci-fi adventures to life for you. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts, and we will see you in the next adventure.